Hello everyone, this is Shawn Galloway with ProAct Safety. And I welcome you to the webinar and the video here, a proven framework for safety culture assessments. In this 30-minute webinar, I'd like to share with you this framework, this approach that we've used successfully throughout the world in every major industry and well over 1,000 sites and locations. Now, as we always say in a lot of our teachings and a lot of our material that we put out there, take these ideas and make them fit your organization. The framework has worked very, very successfully in our organization with the clients that we've worked with, but it's also worked well with people that we have trained within the organization to self-assess. You know, a lot of people look at culture assessments and feel an outside voice and an outside set of eyes can be more effective. Other people on the other side of the camp feel as though an internal look can be more effective because we're closer to the culture. Whether you're close to the issue or further away from the issue, who's really going to open up? Who has the credibility? Are people going to provide the quote-unquote company answer? Are they going to really give you insight? But that's part of what we're going to talk about today is what are we trying to accomplish with a culture assessment? I'm going to show you this framework. I'm going to show you the steps and all the things to consider with these steps. But I'd like to first start off with something to kind of debunk a lot of the things that's out there. At the time of this writing, I've published close to 100 articles on safety excellence and safety culture. We've just turned in the book, which by the time you're probably purchasing or watching this video here, our book should probably be on the shelves, The Steps to Safety Culture Excellence. We've turned it into the publisher. But there's a tremendous amount of content out there about you need to develop a safety culture. We get people that contact us almost weekly for help on helping them establish a safety culture. The first thing to always remember is that you already have one. Everybody has a safety culture, but is it the one that you want? And theoretically, there's no such thing as a safety culture because safety is an element of your culture just like customer service and productivity and quality. But everybody already has that safety element of their culture. Is it the one that you want? Now, the other thing to remember is that no two cultures are the same, even if you have sites that are side by side. Think about your own organization. Is there a different way that the executives do it than the employees? Or let's get closer than the employees and their first line or frontline supervisors. There's always going to be multiple cultures and subcultures. Is there a production culture that may be a little bit different than a maintenance culture? Is there a night shift culture that's different than a day shift? And so on. So there's already going to be existing cultures. But if we want to advance and evolve the culture, realize this as well, that cultures don't resist change. This might be something that's a little bit controversial, but cultures don't really resist change. Neither do people. You don't resist change. What you typically resist is the force, however. Force change is almost always temporary. When you and the force go away, so does the change. So people don't necessarily resist change. They resist being forced to change. Cultures change all the time when they want to. You change all the time when you've made the decision and commitment to do so. So if we really want people to be involved in this, we need to make sure that there's some ownership, that people understand why we're trying to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, because they respond emotionally to change before they respond logically to change. So if we want to go out there and we want to have a successful process, we need to make sure that we have a very good strategy to assess the culture. We have really good plans, and we also have the flexibility to make subtle changes as we go. I love what Mike Tyson, the boxer, once said. He said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. They said it a little bit differently in the U.S. Army. They say that all strategies are successful until contact with the enemy, because the enemy hasn't voted yet. We need to develop this framework, but we need this framework to be flexible. So if you're going to do this yourself, there's a ton of resources that are available to you. You can find them on our website. There's a lot of other information that's out there. But we want to encourage that you have the right mindset and at least the right framework to go out there and have a great success with this. So the first thing that we're encouraging you to discover is, what are you trying to accomplish with the safety culture assessment? Is it just to understand the perceptions? Is it to gather an understanding of where you are right now? What's your current moment in time? They say that one of the first principles in navigation is, where are you right now? Where are you starting at? Is your goal to improve? Is your goal to find those transformational opportunities, that one thing that if you were to focus on could have the biggest impact. Some organizations want to compare themselves to others within their organization or within the industry. I think that often that becomes an exercise in futility. Trying to become or compare yourself to another culture, you're never going to be that other culture. A lot of cultures can compare themselves and can match some of the characteristics, but it's the capabilities that are often different. For example, if you haven't met me in person, I'm only 5'8". I'm never going to be a national basketball player for the United States. I'm never going to be an NBA player. I'm not that tall and I can't jump that high. So you're not going to make me into a successful NBA player. But I'm skilled in a lot of other things. So what's the best I can do? What are my capabilities? It's the same thing in the culture. Rather than trying to become like somebody else, which is almost pointless, what's the best you can be? Now, certainly if you want to look at other cultures to see what are they doing well so we can learn for that, I fully support that. But trying to become like another culture is often demotivating to the people within it. Are we trying to adjust or change some things? Have we made some progress and we want to see, has it stuck within the culture yet? Your culture is your most effective sustainability mechanism. So is your goal to see the impact that it's having? Is it to focus? Maybe it's justification for trying some new things. Or if you're in the advanced camp, you're starting to measure your culture. If you're not measuring and managing the safety element of your culture, your ability to be successful will be determined by the existing culture. Cultures do work hard to maintain the status quo. It's like that joke, change is hard, you go first. People don't necessarily, and cultures don't resist change, as I've already said, but they can be leveraged very effectively to really get some fantastic progress and results. So what are you trying to accomplish with this? Why are you doing this? You know, this answer needs to be available when you start to communicate the value proposition to whomever's going to be funding this or whoever's going to be in charge of it or even impacted by it. So what's in the scope? What's outside of the scope? Some safety culture assessments, we actually interview members of the community. Some assessments, we actually interview members of the regulatory agencies. Most of them, you at least involve your contractors, both short and long-term contractors, because they impact the culture that you're established, that you already have, or the culture that you'd like to have. Who's going to see the results? Is this something you're going to communicate openly with everyone? Is this something that you're concerned about what you might find, so this needs to be performed under attorney work product? What's the plan to follow up with it? All disappointment is based on a set level of expectations. If people think, because they've drawn the conclusion that they're going to get some sort of feedback, but you don't plan on that occurring, that needs to be a part of your strategy, and that needs to be part of the communication. So overall, what's the timeline? Is if you have a site of 300 people or so, how much time do you think it's going to take to get a good sampling? Usually people tend to shoot for about 20% or so of the population, unless it's a very small site. You have a site of 50, there is no real statistical sample of that. You might need to interview close to everyone across all the different shifts and all the different times and everything. But there's a whole sampling strategy to this, and in the framework of the webinar here today, we can't go into all the details, but generally, again, you want it to be around 20%. You do want to make sure that you're involving people from all the different major areas, all the different shifts within those major areas. There's a lot of stipulation around who's going to be interviewed privately, who's going to be in groups. If you have labor representation there, you absolutely want to involve them in the very beginning, and I would argue even the planning of this process. You want to make sure you're not mixing levels. In other words, no one's boss or even their friend's boss sitting in on those sessions. You want it to be bi-level in the organization, because people might feel intimidated to not even brag about the great things that their boss is doing. You want people to know that this isn't a fault-finding exercise. The goal is to better understand how we can continuously get better. But if people have somebody's boss in there, it's very difficult to even have an open conversation, even if it's not a fault-finding exercise. So this, in general, is what the framework looks like. As you can see here, there's 7 different steps, and I'm going to break them down one by one. Now, the average tools that people use are obviously starting up at the top. You have to have some interviews. Usually those are a focus group, but there's several people that we encourage that you interview one-on-one, like the site leader, like HR, for example, but there are several others as well. You want to conduct a perception survey, and I'll talk a little bit about the perception surveys in a minute. Now, do you do those perception surveys in advance as a part of the process? There's different ways that you can go about doing this. You want to analyze the accident, the incident, the near miss, the injury data, all the things that you've had here to give this some sort of a grounding metric. If you identify what the culture is focusing on, are they focusing on the right thing based on what would have prevented a good percentage of the injuries, of the incidents that occurred? Is it mostly conditional items? Is it mostly behavioral items? You have to look at all of that. You have to have a firm understanding of the existing safety program. Now, this is why some people will say, let's use our existing safety person. But what's the perception of the existing safety individual, the safety professional? Are they viewed as a great safety coach, or are they viewed as a safety cop? You have to have all those things in consideration, but you want to at least have a firm understanding of what existing processes, programs, initiatives are currently in place there, and also what we've done in the past, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. You want to accomplish a physical tour of the facility. Even if you know what the environment looks like, how do people work together? And of course, there's a site questionnaire. We provide, when we do this in workshops, and we provide a license of all of our intellectual property so they can be used and modified and everything, we provide a lot of this content. But again, the purpose of this webinar is to give you a framework, so if you're able to, you can do some of this yourself. So step one, you want to review the documentation. You want to look at the incident data at least over the past 3 to 5 years. Now, as you're performing a Pareto analysis on that, you want to look at preventability, not just grouping this. Most organizations group it by the type of injury, the body part, etc. Look at it in preventability. What could have prevented? What are the main things that need to be focused on to prevent that from happening? But you also want to look at the existing programs. Some of the discussions are going to go into the area of, say, a safety work order request. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that, what happens when an employee identifies an unsafe condition, a missing guard, slip hazard, electrical hazard? Who do they turn that into? Do you have an existing program? Because the conversation's going to eventually go down the path of whether people feel it's effective or not. If people think that you don't have an existing program, but the reality is you do, well, it's not going to focus you on going out and creating a program. Now you've identified there's a communication opportunity. So it's important before you start all of this, all your perception survey development, or if you're using existing perception surveys, and most importantly before the interviews, that you have a firm understanding of what exists there. Now, you want to communicate to people prior to the employee interaction. I encourage multiple means of communication. My favorite quote on communication by George Bernard Shaw, the late Irish playwright, he once said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. Don't communicate this once. Don't just communicate it twice. Communicate it multiple times. If somebody's going to be coming into a session and there's some consultant, internal or external there, that's going to be interviewing them on something, even if it's with a group of their peers, and they don't know what this is about, I promise you, 9 times out of 10, people's guard is going to be up. They're going to be a little bit concerned, wondering, uh-oh, what did I do wrong? What are we trying to accomplish here? How is this going to be used against me? We've done this even with organizations where we've created a recorded toolbox talk because they felt as though somebody from outside their organization could communicate this better. But the key thing is here is people need to understand, again, why are we trying to do this? What's the objective? What's in scope? And all those questions I asked in the very beginning. Next, you need to conduct a location walk. This obviously is more important for individuals that are not intimately familiar with operational flow and the type of work that people do and how the work's carried out. But what you're looking for is, how is work accomplished? Is it primarily through teams of individuals? Is there a normal gradual flow of handoff of product? Do people work together? Do we have a bunch of siloed activities? This is all important as you're putting the big picture of this together. The next thing is you have to You have to discuss with leadership what you're trying to accomplish. Now, what you want to communicate to them and provide opportunities for input is to get their understanding. What do they think would be best to accomplish with this? What would provide the most value to them? But why do you feel you're wanting to do this? This is important to get their input here. People support what they help to create. And if we want leadership to be able to free these individuals up, now are we picking people? Or are we relying on supervisors to identify people? You know, if that's the case, I encourage that we have both some shy people and some outspoken individuals. It's the important role of an experienced facilitator to know how to prompt and lead those good conversations with people. So you do want to have some communication with the leadership in advance, because they need to know that, as I've already said, this is not a fault-finding exercise. But they need to know what the plan is, the overall timeline, and again, what's in scope and what's out of scope. At this point, you start to develop your customized safety perception survey. There's a lot of stuff out there. We have a survey that we've used at, I believe if my number's correct, 1,500 or more sites. But more often than not, nowadays, we're using much more of a customized approach. And when you're developing your survey, there's some things to consider. What's the terminology? If you're using a pre-existing survey, and something as simple as calling your first-line individuals supervisors, but here we call them partners, or we call them team leaders, or we call them foremen, the terminology, if that's off a little bit, people often tend to start discounting this and think this isn't for me. So how are you going to pay attention to the terminology? Are there some variables that you're going to want to capture in here? Do you want people to identify how long they've worked for the organization? Obviously, the more variables you put on this, the more people are going to feel as though that it's pointing out to them. But there's a lot of things that you need to consider for the perception survey. How many statements do you want to have on this? Do you want to use a Likert scale of strongly agree all the way to strongly disagree? Most important here is, what are the desirable perceptions you'd like to have exist in your organization, rather than just going out and saying, what do people think? Because the danger of just doing a perception survey is it only gives you insight into questions you know to ask about in advance. The other element to it that can be problematic if you just use a perception survey is it doesn't tell you whether those perceptions are accurate or not, because there's two types. There's correct perceptions and incorrect perceptions. Just because somebody perceives something, obviously it's reality to them. Is it the right perception? So you want to look at this and say, this goes back to the goal and what we're trying to accomplish. If we want an excellent safety culture, what would it look like? What would we hear people saying? What would we see people doing? What are the beliefs that would be fundamental, that would be principled throughout our organization, that would let us know if we achieved excellence in safety, how and why we got there? So what are the key beliefs you'd really like to gather some understanding around? And also, what are the key beliefs you'd like to have exist consistently? Because as we start to close this out, you have to look at a measurement. And this often can be that baseline. If we want people to have 100% strongly agree to all of these statements here, as an example, where are we right now? If we're only at 79%, well, what can we do to really focus on changing those beliefs and perceptions so it changes the decisions people make, so it changes their behavior at all levels of the organization, so it changes their experiences and the stories that they hear throughout the work? So you want to make sure that you customize your perception survey. There's a lot of stuff off the shelf, but I encourage you to consider a perception survey that's customized to your organization. There's webinars we've provided on this. There's articles that we've written. So there's a ton of information that's out there that you can find to learn how to best do this yourself. The next thing is you have to conduct the interviews, whether they're group or whether they're focused one-on-one. So what are you trying to accomplish here? If you've performed the perception survey in advance, now you can look at understanding the validity of those perceptions. You can also do something that perception surveys won't tell you. You can gather insight into what's influencing those perceptions. Here's an interesting little aside. Some people prefer to a perception survey as a leading indicator. And I think in the grand scheme of things, they are. But if you really think about it, a perception survey gives you still a lagging indicator because it gives you a recording of the perceptions that already exist. So is that leading or is that lagging? What's leading to a perception survey are the things that are influencing the perception survey. So this is what a great opportunity you'll have here in the interviews is to try to understand, what are the things, the behaviors from supervisors, from managers, contractors, employees that are producing even the desirable perceptions that are out there. A lot of companies will use a perception survey to figure out what's wrong and try to fix it. That can become demotivating as well if this tool or this process is only focusing on fixing what's not going well or what's not going great. Make sure you also take in consideration the things that you identify that are going well. For example, one group identified at one of their locations there was a very strong fundamental belief that leaders at all levels truly supported safety. Now, to this organization's credit, we spent a tremendous amount of time out there at the site really gathering insight into what people were experiencing and what they'd experienced over the past that had driven this belief. And that came out with some very interesting information that helped us further the rest of the leadership in the organization. Maybe you want to look at the current level of involvement in safety and why you might have that level of involvement or why you don't have that level of involvement. People are either motivated or demotivated. If you're trying to further engagement and involvement in safety, well, these interviews can help you discover why people wouldn't get involved. This is also a great opportunity to get a lot of the information around what's working, what's not working, why people feel it's not working, what they would support, and also what they wouldn't support. Now, we have a list of questions and a list of statements that range into the hundreds of all the different things that you can ask about in these sessions that we've asked about, and that's more fruit for workshops. But again, if you go back to the goals and try to understand what you're trying to accomplish, that'll often lead you in the right path. But I also encourage, don't just stick to those statements because people will feel as though they're being interviewed. You want this to be more conversational. You want to be able to dive in deeper and deeper into the organization so you can truly understand what prompts and what motivates the organization to do what they do and why you have the existing culture that you have. So for these interviews here, who do you want to have as a focus group? Who do you want to have as the individual? At least the key leaders. And usually we want to have a separate interview. Well, we always want to have a separate interview with the bargaining unit, with the labor union, but sometimes you want to interview some of their key people one-on-one. You leave that up to them because in some settings they don't want to be separated from their rest of their elected leaders. So this needs to be a decision that they can help you make. What are the rules of the interview session? Who's going to be involved? How are we going to identify the people? How are we going to get them there? I mentioned this earlier. If you have a small site or a small group, you might need to interview everyone, again, in small groups. Where are the locations? Do you want to interview people as they're right in the middle of their work, or can we somehow separate it away or right at shift time to where you can get people broken away so we can have these conversations? Trying to do it while somebody's at a control board, turned around, answering questions, but might have to respond if some sort of upset in the process is not the most effective way. Are there going to be literacy issues or language challenges? Even in America, there are multiple common languages within the United States. So you have to take that in consideration, and in several areas as well, you don't have the level of literacy that would allow you to just send out a perception survey or even have pen or pencil and paper in front of somebody. You might have some literacy challenges. You don't want anybody to be embarrassed, so you want to work with HR and best understand how you can address that. Now, the last thing is you want to provide a report. Now, a lot of the reports that are out there focus on, again, comparing you. This is how you compare to your similar organizations in your industry. And I kind of look at that and say, so you compare, so what? What's the value out of knowing that you compare or knowing that you're 2/10 better than others in your industry? Is that really the goal of the safety culture assessment, to just understand how you compare? I want to encourage that you focus on it and say, well, what are the things that we're doing really well that we can build off of? Even beyond just safety as your culture assessment. Look at quality. If you have on-time delivery, what are the things that the organization is capable of doing better than anyone else? Why are they able to do that? What made that work? If you were able to implement Lean or Six Sigma or other major methodologies and they were hugely successful, what are the things that made that happen? Can we leverage that? One of the most effective ways to minimize resistance to change is to minimize the perception of it. Can we look for some things that have worked really well that we can build on or we could leverage? Are there some things that we just need to stop doing? Peter Drucker proposed many, many years ago, the late management guru, that too often organizations focus their leaders on trying to understand what they need to start, when in reality, they first need to step back and look at it and try to understand what they need to stop doing first. You know, are there some things that we're just doing that are really compromising our results? Are people waking up motivated, coming to work, and we're beating the motivation out of them? People are willing to get involved and give you great levels of engagement and participation, especially for something as important as safety, if they can see how it benefits them, not just benefits the organization. Are there some things that might threaten your capability to be successful? I would argue that unless you're a very well-run organization, you're not going to have a very well-run safety culture. If the organization is struggling with economic downturn and so on, and significant competition in the marketplace, those are things that are going to compromise some of the decisions people make at all levels of the company. You need to understand where those things are. That may not be the popular thing today to say, but that's the reality. What might threaten you? They teach in the military it's a bad idea to get surprised by sniper fire. You want to figure out where those ambush points are before you get ambushed. So what are the things out there that need to be realized as potential threats? And what are the things that are opportunities to perhaps prioritize? And this is where you start really getting into that transformational thinking. I started off with this. If we're trying to accomplish a safety culture assessment, what one thing, if we were to be successful at, would give us the biggest impact? This is what your report needs to focus on. You can break it up into different categories of leadership, or the structure that they have, or the existing programs and processes, the history of change initiatives, the communication. Those are a lot of things that we communicate, as well as everyone else in these safety culture assessments. But what's most important to people is, at the end of the day, what do we need to focus on? Where, if we aligned our activities and our initiatives, would give us the biggest progress in our safety performance and the safety culture that we're trying to establish here. Remember, everybody has a safety culture, so how can we move in a better direction? So one of the final questions here is, how are we going to measure progress and how are we going to measure the impact? An interesting study came out in 2010 from the Harvard Business Review. They identified that one of the most effective motivators in a work setting, it wasn't money. While that's a motivator, so is peer recognition and recognition from your supervisor, your boss. The most effective motivator turned out to be visible progress. If we can see things progressing, see things getting better. So what are going to be your cultural indicators of things are progressing? Now, if you go back to the perception survey, that's one way. But if you identify that there are some key behaviors that supervisors need to provide to really change those perceptions, how often are the supervisors doing it? If there are some key things that need to happen with contractor communication to really affect the contractor's performance and the overall impression of the contractor, how often is that happening? If you visit our website, there are several articles on measuring and managing culture change. Again, all this information is, at the current time of this recording at least, and I have no plans to do otherwise, freely available. Access those articles, use them. There are many different other frameworks that you could use to measure and manage your progress. If we're going to be really impacting the culture, people need to see how it's advancing. If we're going out there and we're just going to focus it on our incident rate, well, if we get 0 recordables and we don't know precisely what we're all doing to achieve 0 recordables, what's our confidence we're going to repeat it next year? We have to start looking at it and moving beyond just looking at results to looking at performance. If we got great results, fantastic. Did we purposefully do the performance that it helped us achieve the results, or did we just get luckier today? You can measure and you can manage safety culture evolution. You can manage and measure a culture. It's not an easy thing to do, and we have to remember that often in measurement, An imprecise measurement of the right thing can be better than an imprecise measurement of the wrong thing. Once you get to a level of maturity in your culture and your safety management systems, your incident rates are not going to tell you how to get better. So you have to start looking at it saying, well, what does safety culture excellence look like? What would we see and hear people doing that lets us know this is why we have great results? Now let's go out and start measuring that. Move your measurements of your safety culture away from what you don't want, because we already measure all of that in safety. We measure our incidents, frequency, cost, etc. Start measuring what you want. So what is the culture of safety excellence that you want? What's it going to look like when you get there? And align this framework and these ideas here to help you best understand how you can get there. I hope these ideas are helpful for you. Please feel free to contact us if you have further questions or if there's anything that we can personally help you with. If you have suggestions for other topics or other areas or even articles, we'd love to listen to them. We want to make sure that what we do provides value recognition for you to make your job much easier to help us keep the world a little bit better of a safer place. Have a great day. Thank you.